First, let me react to Admiral DeFork's comment about multipolarity, and then I'll get into my discussion. I totally agree that we should come up with another term of multipolarity. Why? Because we are entering into what I call a highly uneven, polycentric global system in which the actors, whether they're states, anti-state actors, or non-profit groups, or businesses, or Elon Musk, all have highly uneven power capabilities and influence. Nevertheless, major powers are still trying to coalesce these groups into rival alliances, and that's the danger we're facing today, is a NATO, U.S., NATO, EU, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Israel alliance against Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and other states. That's what Trump is trying to break, if he can do it. The question I'm raising today is whether or not his methods and his tactics are appropriate to preventing the real possibilities of a major power war. And I will say, first of all, you should read number 1, Geostrategics, where I talked about the NATO, EU. This is the first issue. I'm very proud. In 2001, I argued that the uncoordinated double enlargement of NATO and the EU could provoke a Russian backlash, a Russian alliance with China, and a possible war with Ukraine. That was in 2001, even though I had said it in other books in 1994, 1997. And the second one is actually right on the thesis of today. It's a Géostratégie pour la paix mondiale. That's number 2. So I'm just repeating myself like a broken record. But the problem is the situation has become even more dangerous than I described it back in 2001. So it's an honor to speak to you today on the crucial issue of global security and a potential path to a sustainable global peace on the 3rd anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war, a war that could have and should have been prevented by concerted U.S. and European policy. Now, after 3 years of an unnecessary war, the decisions made in the coming months will determine whether we move towards towards major power cooperation in a global concert, or else deeper alliance polarization and a potential NATO-Russia conflict. This is not an official presentation, if you haven't figured that out. I am a critic and have been a critic of the Trump administration. Nevertheless, I believe the Trump administration is correct to seek an end to the Russia-Ukraine war. The question is not the goal, but the nature of the diplomatic process in which the Trump administration is taking to achieve peace, and whether that diplomacy will enhance the overall prospects for peace. It is crucial that U.S. and international diplomacy achieve a ceasefire that leads toward a sustainable peace that can serve as a stepping stone towards a new and more constructive U.S., European, Ukrainian, Russian relationship. If correctly managed, a new relationship between the U.S., Europe, and Russia can in turn work in concerted fashion with rising powers such as China and India, among other states, in seeking to mitigate, if not eventually resolve, other major conflicts between China and Taiwan, North and South Korea, Israel, Palestinians, and Iran through diplomatic compromises. That's the ideal, but can it be achieved? As I mentioned, I have been arguing for years that NATO and EU uncoordinated double enlargement was provoking a Russian backlash. I also argued that the hotspots today are actually expanding as this global rivalry between these two alliance systems intensifies. So the first worst case scenario that's already happened, which I predicted way back in '94, was the possibility of a Russian revanchist backlash versus Ukraine in response to NATO, if not EU enlargement. Here's the point. This is not said by the officials. Not only did the founders of NATO official containment of the Cold War, George Kennan and Paul Nitze, oppose the decision of the Clinton administration to engage in the open-ended enlargement. Others were Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to Moscow. But so too did NATO Supreme Commander General Goodpaster, NATO Supreme Commander General Jack Galvin, NATO Supreme Commander, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff General Saakashvili, as well as the Secretary of Defense, William Perry. The whole military brass was against NATO enlargement, and yet the boys in the Clinton administration went ahead and did it. 1904 Holbrooke, Lake, a whole bunch of others. In warning against the Russian backlash, all of the above supported the European system of cooperative collective security based on a strengthened partnership for peace and involving overlapping U.S., NATO, EU, and Russian security guarantees as a viable alternative to NATO enlargement. The concept of the Partnership for Peace came out of the Pentagon, yet the Clinton administration dumped it. Next, I argued that a neutral, non-nuclear Ukraine was not only key to sustain the post-Cold War European geopolitical equilibrium, but it was also key to sustaining the global geopolitical equilibrium. The more the uncoordinated, open-ended NATO and EU enlargements expanded into post-Soviet space towards the Baltic states and Ukraine, the more Russia would reach out to China, Iran, North Korea, etc., in the formation of a so-called multipolar world as defined by 1997. The possibility of a Sino-Russian axis was already in the works by July 2001, but it was downplayed by the U.S. hidden state. That treaty, though, was revived in February 2022 as a no-limits China-Russia strategic partnership just before Moscow's so-called special military operation against Ukraine. American political military overextension should have been realized for the Europeans by the mid-1990s as the rise of China was becoming evident, and the U.S. was going to increasingly look towards China and Asia, ignoring European security. That was clear by the time Bill Clinton rushed 2 aircraft carriers to defend Taiwan and the specific sea lines of communication. U.S. concerns with the rise of China should have put Europe on warning so that Europe should have begun to deepen its defense coordination, not just widen, but deepen. In contemporary circumstances, though, the situation has become much more dangerous. Trump's America First stance has raised questions as to the sincerity of American defense commitments and NATO Article 5 security guarantees. The Trump administration has threatened a maximalist peace through strength position with respect to both U.S. allies and U.S. rivals alike in the effort to achieve something close to Trump's goals through tough bargaining. In his peace through strength and maximum pressure stratagems, Trump has threatened sanctions, if not threats, to use military force against U.S. rivals, Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, Hamas, in order to pressure these states and groups, anti-state groups, to agree to U.S. demands, while concurrently offering the prospects of peace negotiations with presumed eventual benefits, which may or may not prove real. The problem with Trump is that his ever-shifting stratagems and changing goals do not inspire trust and confidence that the deal will ever be finalized. And we go down the list: China, 10% tax. Well, recently, he's dropped the idea that we do not support Taiwan independence from the official statements, fact sheets. This is symbolic. The U.S. is going to put maximum pressure supporting Taiwan. With respect to Iran, he said, I like a done deal with Iran on non-nuclear. I would prefer that to bombing the hell out of it. But he also said that Israel would not carry out a strike against Iran if there were such agreement. But what happens if there is no agreement? Trump has also pressured U.S. allies, including Denmark, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, with high tariffs. He's threatened military action versus Mexico with respect to Mexican drug cartels without necessarily respecting Mexican sovereignty. At the same time, Trump wants to eliminate alleged Chinese political economic influence from the operations of the Panama Canal so the U.S. can control the sea lines of communication from the Pacific to the newly Christian Gulf of America. The Arctic region has become a new potential conflict zone between the U.S., Russia, and China due to deposits of critical raw materials and rare earths. It's sea lines of communications that significantly reduce shipping time. The Russians and Chinese are taking advantage of global warming, Canada too, because of the shipping times are reduced substantially versus the Suez, and that's going to affect the Middle East indirectly in the long term. And, most importantly, strategic positioning in case of missile attack. One of the reasons Trump is pressuring Denmark and Greenland and Canada is to gain access for radar systems, etc., in the Arctic. So therefore, Trump has threatened military action versus Denmark with respect to selling Greenland, and is pressing Greenland to become independent while pressing Canada to become the 51st state. In his efforts to achieve peace between Russia and Ukraine, while currently seeking to cut overseas commitments with respect to Ukraine in particular, Trump has been shaking up traditional expectations of U.S. allies. Despite the Trump administration reassurances to the contrary, European states, particularly those with closest proximity to Moscow, fear the possibility of a U.S.-Russian condominium or a joint global management that will place the geostrategic and political economics interests of the U.S. and Russia first, and European interests second, if not last. Example of that is in dealing with Ukraine. Trump has demanded up to 50% of Ukrainian rare earth deposits, among other critical raw materials, in return for U.S. military, political, economic, financial supports, even if the majority of rare earths are in the Russian-occupied regions of Ukraine. Apparently rejecting the offer, Kiev fears that it would have to sell its resource-rich land to multinational corporations. And in return, and what's not being played out, is Kiev is threatened to redevelop nuclear weapons if it does not obtain real or U.S. nuclear security guarantees in return. And really, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, 1991, is a replay. People forget that Ukraine was held on to a substantial number of nuclear weapons. Boris Yeltsin was threatening, after the Cold War ended, Yeltsin was threatening to use force against Ukraine if they didn't give up the, and the Clinton administration worked with Yeltsin. U.S. played a good cop, pressuring Ukraine, offering Ukraine financial assistance and rewards if they give up their nukes, and Yeltsin threatened to use the force. Good cop, bad cop relationship worked to press Ukraine to sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, and now suddenly we hear Zelensky threatening to develop nukes. Okay. Trump does not want, his problem is he wants to see a positive return on U.S. investment, spending U.S. taxpayer money for supporting Ukraine in its war, even if up to 90% of that money goes to the U.S. military-industrial complex and corporations and nonprofits, as if that money will ever return to taxpayer profits. Tax pockets. The profits won't go to the pockets. So, at the root of this conflict, then, is Trump's maximum pressure bargaining. It's to gain economic concessions in exchange for possible security guarantees to Ukraine. This is at the roots of the insecurity-security dialectic for Ukraine, as the latter continues to battle it out with Russia. But more than that, Trump is engaging in a maximum pressure strategy on Europe by engaging in policies of high tariffs and increased defense spending, combined with the attempt of U.S. politicians, Vice President Vance, influential individuals like Elon Musk, to support populist and right-wing extremists. This appears intended to weaken the essentially supranational nature and social democratic nature of the European Union governance. The combination of these pressures could lead to the further breakup of the EU after Brexit. A weakened EU would permit the U.S., Russia, if not China, to more freely assert their political, economic, and strategic interests in Europe. We have the Heritage Foundation Project 2025, Elon Musk, Vice President Vance meeting with the co-leader of the German AfD, etc. This is the double aspect of Trump's policy. Weaken what he sees as the main competitor to U.S., which ironically is Europe, not so much Russia or China. China's second. U.S. steps towards a unilateral peace through strengthened missile defense program under Trump's Iron Dome program, appears to contradict Trump's calls for nuclear arms and missile reductions with Russia and China, and that could risk a new nuclear and hypersonic arms race. The Trump administration plans to take $50 billion away from what it's called woke Biden-era non-lethal programs and instead put that money on President Trump's America First, Peace Through Strength priorities. Our new Secretary of Defense says he wants to make the U.S. military once again into, quote, the most lethal, badass force on the planet to keep our country safe. Direct quote. Some of the programs will be cut and government waste ostensibly eliminated. Funds for border protection, fighting transnational criminal organizations, nuclear modernization, submarine programs, etc., cybersecurity will be continued. It's not clear he's really going to make any budget cuts, but he's going to redirect them in more peace through strength purposes. So, are we moving towards peace through strength or World War Trump? As I've argued, key to global, regional and global peace is a nuclear, non-nuclear, neutral Ukraine. A non-nuclear, neutral Ukraine is crucial to the establishment of a new post-Cold War equilibrium in Europe and abroad. To reach such a sustainable peace, the U.S. will need to coordinate with major and regional powers most impacted by the Russia-Ukraine war in both bilateral and multilateral diplomatic efforts. Now, right now, Trump is engaging with Russia first, but he's reassured, his underlings have reassured the Europeans that they are in communication with what's going on. Whether that's true or not is another question, but certainly bilateralism will ultimately lead to multilateralism if this goes through as thought through. To achieve a sustainable peace, going beyond the ceasefire will mean the deployment of international peacekeeping forces that are acceptable to both Kiev and Moscow. These can be from non-aligned states, such as India, South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, or Saudi Arabia, or maybe more neutral European states, Hungary, Slovakia, maybe Italy. These non-threatening peacekeepers should oversee forced withdrawals, prisoner exchanges, buffer zones, ceasefire enforcement under a general mandate of the UN, or perhaps more likely, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, since there has now been a resolution in Congress to defund the UN. Just entered Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives the other day. A peace settlement should eventually allow for future territorial compromises and eventually involve shared or international sovereignty over contested areas. In this proposal, rather than the Americans seizing all the rare earths and resources of Ukraine, the U.S., EU could work with other countries, including Russia, China, India, in an international-backed consortium to develop Ukraine's mineral and energy wealth in both Ukrainian and Russian-occupied areas. It would be an international consortium, not an American one. A portion of the funds raised could help support war reparations, peacekeeping, and reconstruction. Similarly, simultaneously, with international forces and some European forces deployed in Ukraine, Washington and Moscow should seek to reshape European and global security cooperation and begin to establish confidence and security building measures throughout all of Eastern Europe, if not other conflict zones. This means the eliminating or reducing conventional arms and forging a new conventional force in Europe treaty. In addition to seeking to ameliorate conflict between Ukraine and Russia, multilateral negotiations should take place with respect to disputes between Russia and the Baltic states, Russian Kaliningrad and the Suwalki Corridor, Suwalki Gap, Transnistria and Moldova, Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia. Working with Beijing as a mediator is essential, in my view, because of its political and economic influence. In other words, it has to be a package. It can't be we can't just focus on Russia and Ukraine. What Putin wants, what he says he wants, is a general U.S., Russian, NATO accord. So I'll hold it there. But then next point is to develop a future strategic arms control deal. We're almost out. Almost every arms control treaty is gone. It's evaporated. We are on the cusp of a major nuclear and conventional arms race. By 2026, the U.S. is planning to deploy new intermediate range missiles in Germany. This is not being talked about, but it's a replay of the crisis of the 1980s when the U.S. deployed Pershing and cruise missiles. And they're also going to deploy them in the Philippines and probably Guam. So intermediate range missiles are war-fighting weapons. You keep your ICBMs in the background, and you use your intermediate range and your short-range missiles for attack. So U.S. and Russia need to find a transparency mechanism dealing with the missile defenses systems that the United States has already deployed in Eastern Europe. One proposal out of the Obama administration was joint U.S.-Russian controls over missile defense systems. That's not going to happen immediately, but it could take place as Trump begins to play Ronald Reagan. His missile defense, what he calls the Iron Dome, is the same thing as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, that Reagan had talked about. All right, formal establishment of Ukrainian neutrality, accompanied by deployments of international peacekeeping forces and European and global arms accords can serve as incentives for Russia to end the war. For its part, Kiev would obtain strong security guarantees from the U.S., Europeans, and other states in backing the deployment of international peacekeepers in key regions of contention. If a sustainable peace can be established with respect to Ukraine, accompanied by a new concerted NATO-European-Russian relationship that involves U.S., European-Russian, and global arms reductions and arms eliminations, the task of reaching sustainable peace accords in other regional conflicts will prove much less difficult. New arms reduction elimination agreements will also reduce the expenses of a more unified European defense capability. Europe's talking about building, finally, after years, building a more unified defense capability. But if we reduce the missiles on both sides, NATO and Russia, and U.S. and China, then Europe will not be forced to build up as much. The danger, however, is Trump's erratic unilateralist America First tactics involving maximalist positions to force concessions, such as high tariffs on both U.S. allies and rivals alike, cutbacks in U.S. AID and other U.S. soft power tools, ostensibly in the effort to reduce the monstrous U.S. budget deficit and mounting debts, plus public and private support for extreme political parties, in addition to congressional threats to defund the UN, not only tend to exacerbate ongoing conflicts, but foster new ones. Rightly or wrongly, a number of European states, particularly those on the NATO front line with Moscow, have feared that Trump's radical about-face involving the effort to reverse course and prevent a direct NATO-Russia military confrontation have questioned the credibility of U.S. commitment to NATO's Article 5. If Trump fails to establish a sustainable peace between Russia and Ukraine, as this possible negative scenario points to the necessity for Europeans to strengthen more autonomous defense capabilities by building a Franco-Russian defense corps, the chances of yet another global war will augment. Much as the case before World War I and World War II, Homo geopoliticus is definitely entering a moment that the Biden administration repeatedly referred to as an inflection point in history, a moment that could either turn the world toward global peace or towards a devastating major power conflict. I'll leave them that. Thank you.